Jessamine Whitmore was halfway out of the mercantile when something on the back of her grandmother's deed stopped her cold. Faded pencil lines crossed the brittle paper. An arrow pointed inward. Beneath it was a single word she could barely make out. No one had mentioned a map. No one had mentioned anything hidden at Splitrock Hollow. Minutes earlier, the men in the store had laughed when she spent her last $17 preparing to live there. 40 acres of rock and ravine, they told her. No water, no future. A place fit for rattlesnakes and nothing else. But her grandmother had lived on that land alone for 30 years, and she had kept it until she died. Jessamine folded the deed and slipped it into her coat. 2 days later, she would follow that arrow into the mountains. What waited inside the rock had been hidden for decades, and someone else already knew it was there. The finality of the latch clicking shut carried the weight of a coffin lid dropping into place. Jessamine Whitmore stood on the other side of that door, the September dust of the porch settling on her cracked boots, the late afternoon light casting her shadow long across the dirt yard like something the house had spit out. The air at this altitude was already thin, already sharp, carrying in its bite the promise of a winter that would show no mercy to anyone caught without shelter. In her left hand, she clutched a small leather pouch containing $17 in mixed coin, her entire severance from the world she had known for 18 years. In her right, she held a folded, brittle deed, its edges soft from decades of handling by hands that were no longer alive. These two objects represented the full measure of what Reuben Whitmore believed his eldest child was owed. A woman grown makes her own way, he had told her, his voice flat as packed earth, his eyes fixed on the far wall where a water stain spread like a map to nowhere. There was no malice in the words. There was something worse. There was arithmetic. One less mouth in a house that could barely feed thee. Mouths remaining was a gain that could be measured in pounds of flour, in weeks of survival. He had made his calculation, weighed his daughter against a sack of grain, found the grain more essential. She did not look back at the house. She did not allow herself to see the pale face of her younger brother, Thomas, pressed against the rippled glass of the kitchen window. His breath fogging the pane, his 13-year-old eyes wide with a confusion that would eventually harden into something else. Looking back was a luxury she could not afford. Luxuries were for people with more than $17 to their name. The road into the town of Drover's Bend was a rutted scar cut through sagebrush, dropping from the high pastures where the Whitmore homestead clung to its last season of relevance, down into the valley where the town squatted along a shallow creek. Jessamine walked it with the deliberate pace of someone conducting an inventory. One wool coat, patched at both elbows, given to her mother by a church donation box 7 years ago. 2 cotton dresses, both faded to the color of old dishwater. A tinderbox with a loose hinge. A folding knife with a blade that needed sharpening. The $17, the deed. She turned each item over in her mind the way a general might survey a dwindling arsenal before a siege, knowing that what she carried now was all she would ever carry, unless she found a way to multiply it through labor, luck, or sheer obstinate refusal to accept the verdict the world had already rendered. The deed felt like the cruelest item in her possession. She had unfolded it once, briefly, before leaving. It described a parcel of land her grandmother, Edith Whitmore, had claimed decades ago, a place called Splitrock Hollow, situated in the high country northwest of Drover's Bend. Nobody in the family had ever spoken of it as anything other than a joke. Edith had been the family's quiet embarrassment, a woman who had lived alone on worthless rock for 30 years, who had refused every offer of civilized company, who had died in that solitude without explanation or apology. The deed was her only bequest, passed through Reuben's hands to Jessamine's, with the unmistakable implication that useless things should be given to those who had been deemed equally so. Drover's Bend revealed itself as she crested the final hill. A single street of timber buildings lined both sides of a hard-packed road. A livery stable, a saloon with a crooked sign, a land office with its windows dark. The mercantile, Haskell's Provisions, occupied the largest building, its broad porch stacked with barrels of nails, coils of rope, sacks of feed leaning against the railing like exhausted sentries. A few horses stood hitched at the rail, their tails flicking at flies. 2 men sat on the porch of the saloon, watching her approach with the idle curiosity reserved for strangers, stray dogs, or impending weather. She pushed through the door of the mercantile. The smell hit her first, a dense, comforting blend of cured leather, dry goods, coffee beans, coal oil, the faint sweetness of molasses in a barrel near the counter. The shelves were stacked deep with the currency of frontier survival. Tins of peaches, bolts of canvas, jars of penny candy catching the light from the front window. A rack of rifles stood behind the counter, their barrels gleaming with a thin coat of protective oil. The store represented everything she could not have, a cathedral of preparedness built for people who possessed the means to prepare. Mr. Haskell stood behind the counter, a thick man with a gray mustache that drooped past the corners of his mouth, his spectacles perched on a nose that had been broken at least once. He looked up from a ledger, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. A younger man leaned against the pickle barrel near the stove, dressed in stained buckskin, a fox pelt draped over one shoulder. This was Cotter Bry, a trapper whose territory covered the high ridges north of town, a man whose opinion of himself exceeded any reasonable assessment of his accomplishments. Jessamine laid the deed on the counter without preamble. Mr. Haskell picked it up, tilting his spectacles to read the faded ink, his thumb rubbing the brittle paper as though testing its honesty. His lips moved as he read the legal description. Then he set it down, pushed his glasses back into position, let out a long breath that carried the weight of professional condolence. "The old Splitrock claim," he said, shaking his head slowly. "My sympathies on your grandmother's passing. But this piece of paper describes the most worthless 40 acres in the territory. All rock, all ravine, no water to speak of. The only thing it has ever sheltered is rattlesnakes looking for shade." Cotter Bry let out a bark of laughter from his station by the pickle barrel. He shifted the fox pelt on his shoulder, revealing teeth stained brown with tobacco. "That hollow is where the devil goes when he wants to be alone," he offered, clearly pleased with the construction. "You would not last a week up there, girl. The coyotes would have you by Wednesday." Mr. Haskell shot the trapper a disapproving look, though it lacked genuine force. He turned back to Jessamine, his expression settling into something he likely believed was kindness. $17 will buy you a stagecoach ticket east," he said, "maybe with a few meals along the way. Denver, perhaps. A city has work for a young woman. A domestic position, maybe. That is the sensible path." Jessamine looked at the shelves behind him. She looked at the $17 in her palm. A ticket east meant becoming a stranger in a city that would grind her down to the same nothing she already was, except surrounded by noise instead of silence. At least the rock was hers. The deed said so. A dead woman had thought it worth keeping for 30 years. That fact alone was worth more than a seat on a stagecoach to a place where she would own nothing at all. "I will need a good axe," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the particular firmness of a decision that has already been made somewhere deeper than the throat. "A bow saw, a sack of flour, 50 pounds, a block of salt, however many dried beans the remainder will buy." She paused, then added, "Seed packets if you have them. Carrot, lettuce, whatever is cheapest." The silence in the store had a texture. Mr. Haskell stared at her, his pencil frozen above the ledger. Cotter Bry stopped chewing. Even the clock on the wall behind the counter seemed to hesitate before continuing its next tick. Mr. Haskell calculated the total slowly, his pencil scratching figures on a piece of brown paper, the arithmetic of her ruin laid out in neat columns. He read the number aloud. Jessamine pushed the coins across the worn wood. There was nothing left over. She was purchasing her future at the cost of every cent her father had granted her departure. He packed the supplies in a silence that had shifted from pity to something more complicated, a grudging acknowledgement that conviction, even misguided conviction, possessed its own dignity. The axe was heavier than she expected. The bow saw had a fresh blade. The flour sack would ride on her back for 2 days, a 40-pound burden grinding into her shoulders with every step. As she gathered the supplies, she noticed Cotter Bry watching her from behind, his tobacco-stained grin, already composing the story he would tell in the saloon that evening about the girl who chose a snake den over a stagecoach. She turned the deed over to fold it back into her pocket. Something caught her eye. On the reverse side, in a hand she did not recognize, someone had made marks in faded pencil. Not words exactly, lines. What appeared to be a crude sketch, almost invisible against the aged paper, nearly obliterated by years of handling. She could make out what might have been an arrow pointing inward, a rough shape that could have been the outline of a passage. Below it, a single word so small she had to bring the paper close to her eyes in the dim light of the store. She could not read it. The light was wrong. She refolded the deed, placed it in her coat pocket, filed the mystery away, in the back of her mind where it would wait, patient as stone, for the moment she could give it proper attention. The journey to Splitrock Hollow took the better part of 2 days. A slow, punishing trek that led away from the wagon-rutted roads, away from the last fences marking the boundary of claimed territory, into a landscape that grew steadily more hostile with every mile. The weight of the flour sack turned her shoulders into twin points of grinding fire within the first hour. She stopped often, more often than she wanted, the shame of her own weakness a bitter companion. But she stopped intelligently, choosing rocks where she could lower the sack without having to lift it from the ground again, eating a handful of raw beans, drinking from a creek she crossed in the first afternoon. The terrain transformed as she gained altitude. The sparse grassland gave way to fractured stone. Juniper replaced the sage. The soil thinned until it was barely a film over the bones of the earth. Thorny scrub brush tore at the hem of her dress, leaving threads caught on barbs like tiny flags marking her passage. This was the land the deed described, a place not meant for cultivation, not designed for comfort, built by geological forces that had no interest in human habitation. She saw no signs of life beyond a few resilient lizards frozen on sun-warmed rocks, a red-tailed hawk circling in the vast empty blue overhead, hunting something she could not see. By the evening of the second day, with the sun dropping behind the western ridgeline like a coin into a slot, she found it. A sheer cliff face of gray-weathered granite rose from the earth, its surface scarred by millennia of wind, its base cluttered with fallen rock. At the base where the cliff met a narrow ravine choked with stunted pine, a dark opening gaped in the stone. It was not grand. It was not inviting. It was a mouth that swallowed light, exhaling nothing but silence. This was the cave, her land, her inheritance, her grandmother's 30-year secret. A wave of despair hit her with such force she nearly sat down in the gravel. The trapper was right. Haskell was right. Her father was right. This was a hole in the ground surrounded by rock that could not grow a weed, sheltered by nothing, connected to nothing, valued by no one for excellent reasons. She had spent every dollar she possessed to reach a place that made the poverty she had left look generous by comparison. The wind picked up as the sun dropped, slicing through her coat with surgical precision. There was no other shelter, no stand of trees thick enough to block its assault, no overhang deep enough to sleep beneath. Left with no alternative that did not involve lying down in the open to freeze, she unshouldered her supplies, lit a small piece of tinder, held the trembling flame ahead of her like a prayer, stepped inside. The entrance tunnel was shorter than she expected, perhaps 15 feet of rough passage that required her to duck beneath a low shelf of rock before it opened into a vaulted chamber that swallowed the small light of her flame. The walls were smooth, shaped by water that had flowed through this space for thousands of years, before retreating into deeper stone. The ground was a mix of sand, gravel, small flat stone, perfectly dry. Her footsteps produced a soft, gritty whisper that echoed faintly from walls she could not see. Then she felt it, a shift in the air so subtle it registered first on her skin before her mind could name it. The biting wind that had been tearing at her outside simply ceased. The temperature inside the cave was not warm, not exactly, but it was steady, cool without malice. A constant, consistent atmosphere that bore no relationship to the plummeting temperature outside. She held her flame higher, watched it burn without flickering. No draft, no movement, the air was still as held breath. Then she heard the sound, a slow rhythmic percussion, so faint she thought at first it was her own pulse. Following the echo deeper into the chamber, she found its source. A dark fissure in the far wall, barely wider than her fist, wept a single drop of water at precise intervals. Each drop caught the light of her flame, shimmered gold for an instant, then fell with a clear resonant note into a shallow pool that had carved itself into the stone floor over centuries of patient repetition. She knelt, cupped her hand, brought the water to her lips. Clean, cold, carrying the mineral taste of deep earth, untainted by anything that lived or rotted on the surface. She pressed her palm flat against the cave wall. The stone radiated a faint, deep coolness, the thermal mass of 1,000,000 tons of granite that had absorbed the heat of summer, stored it in its molecular structure, would release it slowly through the winter months, like a coal that never quite went out. This was the secret. This was what the deed truly conveyed. The town saw a useless hole in dead rock. They were measuring value by what the land could grow on its surface, by what could be extracted from its soil, by the conventional metrics of frontier worth. They had never stepped inside. The cave was not a grave. It was a buffer against every extreme the territory could deliver. It was a well that never ran dry. It was a root cellar held at perfect temperature by the earth itself. It was a fortress against the killing frost that took livestock, crops, lives every winter with mechanical indifference. Her grandmother had known this. Edith Whitmore had lived here for 30 years, not because she was mad, but because she had understood something about this piece of ground that no one else had bothered to discover. The despair that had buckled her knees only minutes before drained away, replaced by something harder, colder, more useful. A focused resolve that tasted like iron on her tongue. The work ahead would be brutal. She knew that with the clarity of someone who had just done the math on her own provisions, her own strength, her own solitude. But for the first time since the latch had clicked behind her, she felt solid ground beneath her feet. Not the ground of the porch she had been expelled from. The ground of possibility. She slept that night on the cave floor, her coat pulled tight, her back against the stone wall that held its warmth like a promise. The flour sack served as a pillow. The darkness was absolute, total, a blackness so complete it erased the boundary between open eyes, closed eyes. But the temperature held. The water dripped its patient metronome. She was sheltered. For now, that was enough. Morning arrived as a pale gray wash at the mouth of the cave, the light creeping tentatively into the entrance passage as though unsure of its welcome. Jessamine rose stiff, every muscle announcing its grievance in a chorus of aches that ran from her shoulders to the soles of her feet. She ate a handful of beans, drank from the stone basin, stepped outside into a world that the dawn was painting in shades of amber rust, the deep purple shadow of the cliff face stretching west across the ravine. She surveyed her domain with the methodical eye of someone who has already committed to a course of action, is now cataloging the resources available to execute it. The cliff face ran roughly north-south, its eastern exposure catching the morning sun. The cave mouth faced east. A cabin built against the rock face, sealing the entrance, would receive direct sunlight for the first half of each day. The cabin would be the living space, the human zone of warmth, fire, light. The cave behind it would remain the dark, cool heart of the operation, a stable environment for storing food, sheltering animals, perhaps growing things in soil she would carry in by hand. 2 chambers, 2 temperatures, 1 system. But first, she needed logs. A quarter-mile down the ravine, where a seasonal creek had deposited enough soil over the centuries to support root systems, she found what she needed. A grove of hardy pine, their trunks straight enough for building, their diameter manageable for a single person with an axe, a saw, enough stubbornness to compensate for the skills she lacked. She had never felled a tree. She had watched her father do it, years ago before the drinking had eroded his ambition to a nub. She remembered the way he sized up a trunk, the way he cut the notch on the fall side, the way the tree announced its surrender with a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. Her first attempt was a disaster. The axe bit into the wood at the wrong angle, the handle torquing in her blistered hands, the blade wedging itself so deeply she spent 20 minutes working it free. Her second attempt was marginally less catastrophic. By the 4th tree, she had found something resembling a rhythm. Not efficiency, not skill, but a repeatable process that produced a result she could measure. The tree groaned. The tree cracked. The tree fell with a crash that sent birds erupting from the surrounding brush, their wings beating the air like applause from an audience she could not see. Getting the fallen trunks to the building site was the next impossible task in a chain of impossible tasks that she was beginning to understand would define every day of her life for the foreseeable future. She could not lift a log. She could barely roll one. But she discovered the mechanics of leverage with the desperate ingenuity of someone who has no alternative curriculum. Smaller branches became rollers. She cut pathways through the brush, clearing lanes that the logs could travel along. When pushed, pulled, levered with every pound of her body weight, thrown against a fulcrum made from a flat rock, a sturdy branch. She used the natural slope of the terrain, letting gravity do the work her muscles could not. Every log delivered to the cave mouth represented a full day of effort, a day measured not in hours but in the specific geography of exhaustion mapped across her back, her arms, the palms of her hands where blisters had opened, bled, dried, opened again. By the end of the first week, she had a dozen logs stripped of their branches, lying near the mouth of the cave like the bones of something enormous that had died trying to enter. Her hands were no longer the hands she had left home with. They were raw, cracked, stained with pine sap, beginning to develop the thick calluses that would eventually armor them against the work that remained. The foundation consumed the next several days. She gathered flat stones from the surrounding ravine, levering them from the ground where they had settled over centuries, hauling them to the building site on a crude sledge she built from 2 saplings, a piece of canvas. Her back became an instrument of constant pain, a background noise she learned, to ignore the way one ignores the sound of wind. She laid the stones in a rectangle measured by her own paces, 12 steps long, 8 steps wide. She checked each stone for level using a trick she invented herself. A straight branch laid across 2 points. A small puddle of water poured along its length. If the water pooled to one side, the stone needed adjustment. It was crude, it was slow. It worked. She lived during this period on a thin gruel of flour, boiled with water over a small fire built each evening just inside the cave entrance, where the smoke could escape without filling the chamber. The ration was not enough. She felt her body consuming itself, the relentless demands of the labor drawing on reserves that her meager diet could not replenish. Her dress hung looser. Her cheekbones grew sharper. But the pile of logs grew. The foundation took shape. Each stone laid, each log delivered, was a deposit in an account whose balance she could see with her own eyes, whose interest compounded in the form of something that was beginning to resemble a structure. On the 9th day, she heard footsteps on the gravel outside the cave. She reached for her axe, her heart hammering, her body flooding with the particular fear of a woman alone in territory where the law was a distant rumor. The figure that appeared at the edge of the tree line was small, bent, wrapped in a heavy shawl that had seen better decades. A woman old, her face a map of deep lines carved by sun wind, the passage of years that numbered well past 70. She carried a walking stick made from a gnarled branch, used it to pick her way across the rocky ground with the cautious precision of someone who understood that a broken hip at her age was a death sentence. Jessamine lowered the axe but did not release it. The old woman stopped at the edge of the foundation, surveyed the logs, the stones, the crude beginnings of something that might one day be called a structure. Her eyes, pale blue, sharp as glass shards, moved across the scene with an assessment that was neither approving nor critical. It was the look of someone measuring reality against expectation. "So you are Edith's granddaughter," the old woman said. It was not a question. Her voice was thin, roughened by years of disuse, the voice of someone who spent most of her days talking only to herself. "I am Bertie Tanfield. I live in the draw 3 miles south. Your grandmother was the only person in this territory I considered worth the walk." Jessamine said nothing. She waited. Bertie Tanfield did not seem like a woman who required responses to continue speaking. The old woman moved closer, leaned on her stick, examined the notch Jessamine had cut into the end of the nearest log. Her lips pressed together. "That notch will slip under the weight of the second course," she said without ceremony or cushioning. "You have cut it too shallow. The angle needs to be steeper, a finger width deeper on the underside, so the log above locks into position rather than riding on top." She traced the correct angle in the air with one crooked finger. Jessamine looked at the notch, looked at the imaginary line the old woman had drawn, understood immediately that Bertie was right. The realization carried a sting. She had been doing it wrong. Every log she had notched so far would need to be recut. But the sting was followed by something more valuable, information she could not have obtained any other way, from any book, from any amount of trial, error. Bertie Tanfield stayed for 2 hours. She did not lift a tool. Her body was too frail for labor, her hands too gnarled to grip an axe handle. But her eyes were instruments of devastating precision. She identified 3 more errors in Jessamine's approach. The chinking mixture needed more dried grass, or it would crack when it froze. The chimney stones needed to be laid with their flattest faces inward, or the mortar would not hold. The door frame needed a lintel log, twice the thickness Jessamine had selected, or the weight of the wall above would bow it inward by midwinter. Each correction was delivered without softness, without encouragement, without the padding of social grace. They were facts. Bertie dealt exclusively in facts. As she prepared to leave, picking her way back toward the tree line with the deliberate care of someone who knew exactly how fragile her bones had become, she paused. She did not turn around. "Your grandmother was not a fool," she said, her voice carrying across the gravel with unexpected clarity. "She knew what this land held. She made me swear I would never speak of it. I have kept that oath for 30 years. I will keep it still." Then she was gone, her small figure disappearing into the brush with a silence that seemed impossible for someone who walked with a stick. Jessamine stood in the fading light, holding a log she had been about to notch, the axe suspended in mid-swing. The words settled into her mind like stones dropping into water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Edith had known something, something worth hiding, something worth extracting a 30-year oath to protect. The deed in her pocket suddenly felt heavier, the faded marks on its reverse side pulsing with a significance she could not yet decode. She returned to the notch, recut it to Bertie's specification. The log above When she finally wrestled it into position the following day, locked with a solidity that was immediately, unmistakably superior. The difference was the difference between a structure that would stand, one that would eventually fail. She recut every notch she had already made. 2 days of additional labor. 2 days she could not afford. But when the first wall rose, 4 logs high, the joints tight, the weight distributed with an integrity she could feel. In the way the structure resisted, when she pushed against it, she knew those 2 days had been the most important investment she had made since arriving. The 4 walls went up over the course of the next 2 weeks, an agonizing process of hoisting, levering, fitting, adjusting. She built a crude A-frame derrick from 3 poles lashed together, using her rope to lift the upper logs into position, the stunted pine near the cave mouth serving as an anchor point. The process was dangerous. Each log weighed more than she did. A rope that slipped, a pole that cracked, a log that shifted before she could secure it would crush her, end her, leave her broken on the foundation stones with no one to find her body until the spring thaw brought some wandering trapper past this forgotten corner of the territory. She did not allow herself to think about that. She thought only about the next notch, the next lift, the next log settling into its position with a sound that was part groan, part percussion, wholly satisfying. By the time the 4th wall stood, the cabin was a skeletal box pressed against the gray stone of the cliff, rough, unfinished. The gaps between logs wide enough in places to admit a fist. But it was a structure. It had walls. It had the suggestion of a roof, which she would build from smaller poles laid across the top, covered with layers of pine bough, canvas, soil. It was the first thing she had ever built. It was the first thing she had ever owned through the pure currency of her own labor. The chinking took 3 more days. She mixed the sandy soil with water hauled from the stone basin inside the cave, adding the dried grass Bertie had specified, working the thick mud into every gap with her bare hands because she had no trowel, no proper tools for this kind of work. The cold numbed her fingers within minutes. She would work until the sensation left her hands entirely, then retreat to the cave to warm them over a small fire, then return to the wall, press more mud into more gaps. Slowly, painfully, the cabin transformed. The wind stopped finding its way through. The interior began to hold its own air, its own temperature distinct from the world outside. The fireplace was the crucible. Everything depended on it. Without heat, the cabin was merely a box. With it, the cabin became a home, a place where survival was possible through the months, when the temperature outside would drop to levels that killed exposed flesh in minutes. She identified a section of the cliff face that formed the natural back wall of the cabin, a flat expanse of granite that would serve as the fireback, absorbing heat from the flames, radiating it slowly into the room through the night. She began stacking the flattest stones she could find, building a hearth, then a firebox, then the beginnings of a chimney. The mud mortar was the same mixture she had used for chinking, applied generously between each course of stone. She fashioned a flue that channeled upward toward a natural fissure she had discovered in the rock overhead, a crack barely wide enough to admit her arm. She spent a full day widening it with her knife, a heavy stone used as a hammer, chipping away at the granite in tiny increments that tested the limits of her patience, her wrists, her belief that the task was even possible. The first fire she lit filled the cabin with smoke, so thick she could not breathe. She stumbled outside, coughing, her eyes streaming, the familiar weight of despair settling across her shoulders like a yoke. The chimney did not draw. Hours of work, days of stone laying, the entire system built on a principle that had failed at the moment of its first test. She sat on a rock outside the cabin, her face smeared with soot, her hands raw, the evening cold settling in around her like water filling a hole. Failure. The word tasted like ash. Then she replayed the smoke's behavior in her mind. It had risen initially, curling toward the flue, before pooling, backing up, flooding the room. Something was blocking the draw, not a design flaw, an obstruction. She climbed to the point where the flue met the fissure, reached her arm into the narrow passage, felt a mass of compacted debris, old bird nesting, dried moss, small stones that had wedged themselves into the channel over years of neglect. She cleared it piece by piece, working blind, her arm scraped raw by the rough stone, pulling out handfuls of material that crumbled in her fingers. Then she adjusted the opening, chipping away another inch of rock at the exit point, widening the throat just enough to allow a stronger draft. She lit the second fire with hands that trembled, not from cold but from the particular terror of a person who has invested everything in a single outcome. The smoke rose from the hearth, curled into the firebox, entered the flue. For a moment it hesitated, a gray ghost hovering at the transition point. Then the draft caught it. The smoke drew upward with a sudden, decisive pull, disappearing into the rock, a thin plume emerging from the fissure above the cliff face to be snatched away by the wind. The fire crackled with growing confidence. Heat began to radiate from the stone fireback, filling the cabin with warmth that penetrated her coat, her dress, her skin, reached the aching core of muscles that had not been truly warm in weeks. Jessamine sat before that fire for a long time. The flames painted moving shadows on the log walls. The heat entered her bones with the slow, thorough patience of something that intended to stay. She felt the cabin around her, the weight of the logs she had felled, dragged, lifted, notched with hands that were now more scar tissue than skin. The sound of the fire was the sound of a verdict being read. Not guilty of foolishness, not guilty of madness. The evidence was the warmth spreading through the room, the smoke drawing clean, the wind locked outside where it belonged. She reached into her pocket, withdrew the deed, unfolded it carefully. In the firelight, the marks on the reverse side were finally visible. What she had glimpsed in the dim store in Drover's Bend now resolved into clarity. A crude map, drawn in pencil by a hand that knew the subject intimately, the outline of the cave. The main chamber sketches a rough oval, then a narrow line extending from the far wall of the chamber deeper into the rock, leading to a second shape, smaller, drawn with heavier strokes as though the hand had pressed harder to emphasize its importance. An arrow pointed into this second chamber. Below the arrow, a single word she could now read clearly in the dancing firelight. Keep what? Keep the chamber secret. Keep what was inside. Keep the land. The word was an instruction without context, a command from a dead woman, whose reasons had gone with her into the ground. Jessamine folded the deed, returned it to her pocket. The second chamber existed. Bertie Tanfield knew what it contained, but had sworn an oath of silence. The answer was inside the cave, waiting in the darkness, beyond the point where she had stopped. Exploring on her first night. The passage she had marked but not entered. She would not go tonight. Tonight belonged to the fire, to the warmth, to the victory of a functioning chimney. The cave would keep its secrets a while longer. It had kept them for 30 years. It could wait for a woman who had earned the right to discover them on her own schedule. The next morning she turned to the cave itself. The living system she envisioned required more than a cabin with a working fireplace. The cave was the engine. Its stable temperature, its water supply, its protection from wind, snow, predators made it the essential second half of the equation. Without the cave, the cabin was a shelter. With it, the cabin was the front door of a self-sustaining operation. She began hauling soil. In a sheltered pocket of the ravine, 200 yards from the cave mouth, she had discovered a deposit of dark, rich earth, the accumulated gift of centuries of decomposing vegetation washed down from the slopes above. She carried it in a canvas sack, trip after trip, her back by now so accustomed to burden that the pain had become a background condition. She no longer registered as separate from her own body. She built raised beds in the forward section of the cave, where the ambient light from the cabin door could reach, however faintly. She planted her carrot seeds, her lettuce, pressing them into the dark soil with fingers that understood they were asking something improbable of the earth. Growth without sunlight, harvest without season, a gamble that had no precedent she knew of. She sectioned off the deeper portions of the cave with low fences woven from supple saplings, creating pens for animals she did not yet own. The space was ready. The infrastructure preceded the inhabitants, a city built before its citizens arrived. The dwindling flour sack forced her hand. With the first snows already dusting the highest peaks, she knew she had to return to Drover's Bend for livestock before the winter sealed the passes. The walk back was different this time. Her body had been remade by the weeks of labor. The muscles beneath her dress were dense, functional, stripped of anything that did not serve a purpose. Her stride was longer, her breathing controlled. Her hands, jammed into her coat pockets, were instruments of labor now, calloused at every joint, stained with pitch, dirt, the residue of mortar. She entered the mercantile. The bell above the door announced her arrival with the same thin chime. Mr. Haskell looked up from his counter, his eyebrows climbing toward his receding hairline. "The cave dweller returns," he said, genuine surprise cracking through his professional composure. "I confess I did not expect to see you again. I figured the cold had settled the matter by now." Cotter Bry was there again, occupying the same position by the pickle barrel, as though he had not moved since her last visit. He looked her over with an expression that mixed amusement with something that might have been grudging curiosity. The winter has not even started, girl. What you have built up there, whatever it is, will not survive the first real storm. Mark my words. That hollow will be your burial ground. Jessamine let the words pass through her, the way the wind passed through the gaps she had already chinked shut. She walked to the counter, met Haskell's eyes without flinching. "I need 4 laying hens," she said. "A ewe, a ram, another 50 pounds of salt." She placed her payment on the counter, not the coins from her original $17, which were long gone. During the weeks of construction, she had set trap lines along the ravine, snaring rabbits, squirrels. The pelts, cleaned, stretched on frames she built from bent willow, cured in the cool air of the cave, represented a secondary currency. She had bundled them carefully, brought them to trade. Haskell examined each one, his experienced fingers assessing the quality of the fur, the evenness of the stretch, the absence of cuts or tears. His expression shifted. These were not the pelts of an amateur. They were competent work, not expert, but competent. He quoted a fair price, added it to the credit she needed, calculated the difference. Haskell counted twice, the way a man counts when he believes the numbers are about to confirm a verdict he does not want to deliver. The total balanced, barely. He shook his head but filled the order. The hens went into a crate he provided. The sheep, a sturdy ewe with a thick winter fleece, a young ram with suspicious eyes, were tied with rope. The return journey with livestock was an ordeal that tested her patience more severely than any log, any stone, any mile of the previous trips combined. The sheep protested every incline. The crated hens produced a continuous soundtrack of alarm. She coaxed, pulled, waited, resumed. The procession must have looked absurd to any observer. A young woman in a patched coat leading 2 reluctant sheep along a trail that barely qualified as a path. A crate of panicking chickens strapped to her back above the salt sack. Every step a negotiation between human will, animal instinct. She did not reach the cabin until well after dark, on the second day. Navigating the final stretch by moonlight, the sheep suddenly cooperative as though they sensed the shelter ahead. She led them through the cabin, past the glowing embers of the fire she had banked before leaving, into the cave. The sheep entered the pen she had built. They stood for a moment, ears twitching, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar smells of stone, earth, still air. Then the ewe folded her legs beneath her, settling onto the sandy floor with a sigh that was unmistakably contentment. The cave was dry. The cave was calm. The cave was warmer than any barn in the territory. The hens, released from their crate, scattered briefly, then began pecking at the gravel floor with the focused optimism that defines the species. Within an hour, they had found the raised beds, investigated the water basin, established their hierarchy through a series of brief, decisive confrontations, settled onto a low roost Jessamine had built from stacked stones, a horizontal branch. She stood in the cabin doorway, looking inward. The fire at her back cast a warm light across the threshold into the cave beyond. In the cave, shapes moved in the dimness. The white wool of the sheep, the russet feathers of a hen turning on its roost, the faint green of lettuce leaves improbably emerging from soil that had never seen direct sunlight, the drip of water steady as a heartbeat. She had built this. From $17, a useless deed, the strength of her own body, she had constructed a system that could sustain life through the winter, that was now unmistakably descending upon the territory with the full weight of its intention to kill everything that had not prepared. Outside, the first real snow began to fall. Not the tentative dustings of the previous weeks, but thick, deliberate flakes that accumulated on the ground with visible speed, covering the rocks, the scrub brush, the world, in a white that looked, from inside the warm cabin, like silence made visible. Jessamine pulled the heavy plank door shut. The latch clicked into place with a sound far different from the one that had expelled her from her father's house 6 weeks before. This latch did not lock her out. This latch locked the cold out. This latch was hers. She sat before the fire, the deed in her lap, the word keep glowing in her mind. The cave held its secrets in the darkness behind her. The winter held its threats in the whiteness beyond the door. Between the two, in the small warm space she had carved from nothing, she held her ground. The firelight dimmed as the logs settled. She added another piece of pine, watched the flames climb. Somewhere in the cave, a hen clucked softly in its sleep. The water dripped, the snow fell, the cabin held. Winter in the high country did not arrive. It descended, a slow tightening of the sky's grip on the earth, a gradual erasure of color from the landscape until the world outside the cabin existed only in shades of white-gray, the occasional stark black of exposed rock too steep to hold snow. The temperature dropped in stages, each new threshold announcing itself through the behavior of the water in the stone basin. First it slowed. Then a thin crust of ice appeared at the edges each morning, fragile as window glass, which Jessamine broke with her knuckle before drawing the day's supply. The drip itself never froze. Deep within the rock, beyond the reach of any surface temperature, the source maintained its patient rhythm, immune to the season's assault. Her days assumed a structure as rigid as the cabin walls. She rose before dawn, not by choice but by necessity, the fire's demand for fuel serving as an alarm more reliable than any clock. The embers needed attention every 4 hours. Neglect them too long, the cabin's temperature would plunge to a level that made recovery difficult. Costly in wood, costly in time. She had learned this lesson during the first week of true cold, when she had slept too deeply, woken to find her breath visible in the dim light, the water in her cooking pot skinned with ice. The fire became her first obligation each morning, her last duty each night, a relationship more demanding than any she had known with a living creature. The transition from cabin to cave was a daily passage between two worlds. The cabin was warm, bright when the fire burned well, scented with pine smoke, the domain of heat, light, human activity. The cave was cool, dim, carrying the musk of sheep wool, the dusty smell of chicken feathers, the mineral sharpness of wet stone. She moved between these worlds dozens of times each day, each crossing a small recalibration of her senses. The sheep stirred when they heard her footsteps, the ewe pressing her nose against the sapling fence in anticipation of the dried grass ration. The ram watched from the back of the pen, his yellow eyes tracking her movements with an intelligence she had learned to respect. He was not tame. He tolerated her because she brought food. The distinction mattered. The chickens had established their own civilization within the cave. They roosted on the stone and branch perch she had built, descended each morning with a fluttering commotion that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, spent their days scratching at the gravel floor with the tireless optimism of prospectors, convinced that the next scratch would reveal gold. The discovery of an egg each morning was a transaction she never took for granted. She would lift the warm oval from the nesting box, hold it for a moment in her palm, feel its weight, its smoothness, its improbable perfection. Protein. Survival measured in a shell no thicker than a promise. The garden was her most audacious experiment. The lettuce had responded to the cave's stable temperature with a pale tentative growth that bore no resemblance to the robust heads she had seen in Haskell's store. These leaves were thin, almost translucent, stretching upward toward light that was never quite sufficient. She had improved the situation with a piece of salvage that changed the equation. While clearing debris from the deeper sections of the cave during her first week, she had found, wedged between two rocks near the passage, not yet explored, a metal object. Pulling it free, scraping away the grime of years, she discovered a mirror. Not a lady's vanity mirror, but a working tool. Its surface tarnished but still reflective. Its frame heavy, utilitarian. It had belonged to her grandmother. She positioned it at the cave entrance, angling it to catch the morning light that entered through the cabin doorway, bouncing the beam deeper into the chamber, extending the reach of the sun by another 15 feet. The lettuce responded within days, its leaves darkening from sickly yellow to a pale but genuine green. The carrots remained invisible beneath the soil, their progress measurable only by the feathery tops that had begun to emerge, thin as thread, impossibly delicate. Her meals were spare. A thin stew of dried beans formed the foundation, stretched with whatever the day offered. Salted mutton from the stores she had laid in. An egg when the hens produced one. A few leaves of lettuce torn into the broth, adding a bitterness that tasted like defiance. She ate once in the morning, once in the evening. The portions were not generous. They were calculated, each meal a withdrawal from a finite account whose balance she tracked with the precision of a banker monitoring a loan. She was spending her body's reserves faster than her food supply could replenish them. Her dress hung loose at the waist. The bones of her wrists had become prominent, visible landmarks beneath skin that was perpetually chapped, reddened by cold work, the constant abrasion of rough materials against flesh. The afternoons belonged to maintenance. She mended her coat with stitches that improved marginally with each repair, the thread pulled from the hem of her second dress, which she had sacrificed to the cause of keeping the first dress intact. She sharpened the axe blade on a smooth stone from the cave floor, the repetitive motion producing a sound that filled the silence with its rhythmic whisper. She wove rope from strips of cured rabbit hide, building a supply of cordage that would be essential when spring demanded new construction. She reinforced the door hinges, which had begun to loosen under the constant stress of the wind. She checked the chinking on the north wall, where the cold pressed hardest, filling any crack that had opened with fresh mud mixed in the warmth of the cabin. These were not idle hours. Every task held back the slow advance of entropy, the constant pressure of a hostile environment seeking any weakness in her defenses. A loose hinge meant a door that could blow open in a storm, admitting cold that would take hours of precious firewood to combat. A crack in the chinking meant a draft that would find the sleeping body, rob it of heat through the night. She understood now, with the bone-deep comprehension that comes only from direct experience, that survival on the frontier was not a single dramatic act. It was 1,000 small acts of prevention repeated daily, without applause, without witness. She spoke rarely. Soft words to the sheep when she entered the pen. A low murmur to the chickens as she collected eggs. Her own voice, when she heard it, sounded foreign. A stranger's instrument producing sounds that seemed too loud for the immense quiet of her world. She was utterly alone, yet the word lonely did not describe her condition. Loneliness implied absence, a space where something should be but was not. Her space was full of work, of responsibility, of the constant demanding presence of systems that required her attention to continue functioning. The town, with its judgment, its pity, its confident predictions of her demise, existed somewhere beyond the white horizon. A memory growing fainter with each passing day, like a sound receding down a long corridor. 6 weeks into the deep winter, the sound of a horse reached her ears. She was inside the cave, watering the sheep, when the distinctive crunch of hooves on frozen ground penetrated the cabin walls, filtered through the doorway into the dim interior. She set down the water bucket, moved to the cabin, looked through the small window she had set into the front wall. A salvaged pane from a derelict wagon frame she had found half buried in the ravine during her first weeks. The rider sat tall in the saddle, his horse a big chestnut with a branded hip, steam rising from its nostrils in twin plumes. The man wore a heavy coat lined with beaver fur, a hat with a wide brim pulled low against the glare of snow. Everything about him communicated wealth, authority, the particular confidence of a man accustomed to occupying space that others vacated. He surveyed the cabin, the cliff face, the chimney emitting its thin thread of smoke, with the appraising eye of someone calculating value. Not the value of what existed, but the value of what could be taken. Jessamine opened the door. The cold hit her face like a slap. The rider looked down at her from the saddle, his expression carrying the practiced warmth of a man who had learned that courtesy was a more effective tool than force, at least initially. "Miss Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Leland Stowe. I own the spread south of here, running down to the creek, near on 4,000 acres. He paused to let the number settle. "I knew your grandmother after a fashion. Knew of her, perhaps more accurately. She was a woman of strong opinions about this particular piece of ground." Jessamine waited. She had learned from Berdie Tanfield that silence was more useful than speech when the other party had come with an agenda. Stowe dismounted, looped his reins over a branch with the casual ease of a man who dismounted on other people's property regularly. He walked to the cabin wall, ran his gloved hand along the chinking, examined the chimney construction. His eyes lingered on the door, the window, the foundation stones visible beneath the snow line. His assessment was professional, thorough, devoid of the contempt she had encountered in Drover's Bend. This man was not here to mock. He was here to acquire. "I will be direct," he said, turning to face her, his breath forming precise white shapes in the frozen air. "This hollow sits on the only reliable groundwater source in 15 miles of ridge country. That spring inside your cave feeds a table that my cattle will need come summer. I am prepared to offer you $50 for the deed, free clear, which is roughly $49 more than any assessor in the territory would value it." He smiled. It was a smile that had closed transactions before. Jessamine felt the number land. $50. 3 times what she had started with. Enough for a stagecoach ticket, a room in Denver, weeks of meals, a domestic position secured through an employment agency. Enough to erase the past 3 months of labor, pain, isolation, return her to the world of towns, streets, other people. The offer was rational, generous even, by the standards of frontier land deals where the buyer held every advantage. She looked past Stowe at the landscape. The snow stretched to the horizon, unbroken white, interrupted only by the dark line of the ravine, the occasional spike of a pine top. Everything she had built was behind her. The cabin, the cave, the garden, the animals, the system. "The land is not for sale," she said. Her voice did not waver. It did not rise. It carried the flat finality of a door being closed, latched, barred. Stowe's smile remained in place, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation, a reclassification of the obstacle before him. He nodded slowly, as though her refusal was a move in a game he had played many times, a move he had anticipated, prepared for. "I respect conviction, Miss Whitmore, but conviction does not always survive scrutiny. That deed of yours passed through your grandmother's hands, through your father's, now to yours. 3 transfers, none of them recorded through a proper county office, as far as my attorney can determine. A valid homestead claim requires registration, improvement, continuous habitation. Your grandmother may have met those requirements. Whether the paper trail supports, that is another matter entirely." He mounted his horse, gathered the reins. "I will be making inquiries. If the deed proves deficient, the land reverts to territorial jurisdiction, at which point I will file a proper claim." He touched his hat again, turned the chestnut, rode away across the snow with the unhurried pace of a man who believed time was on his side. Jessamine stood in the doorway until the sound of hooves faded, until the white silence reasserted itself, until the cold drove her back inside. She closed the door, leaned against it. The deed was in her pocket. The word keep was in her mind. The threat was no longer theoretical. Leland Stowe had resources, an attorney, the patience of a man whose wealth could wait out any adversary, whose wealth could not. She had a cabin, a cave, 6 animals, a garden that produced leaves thinner than paper. She pulled the deed from her pocket, studied the map on the reverse side, the arrow pointing deeper, the second chamber. Whatever Edith Whitmore had hidden there, whatever Bertie Tanfield had sworn never to reveal, it was no longer a mystery she could afford to defer. The answer was inside the rock. But the winter was too deep, her resources too thin, her margin too narrow to risk an expedition into unknown passages when every hour needed to be spent maintaining the systems that kept her alive. The cave would keep its secrets until the pressure of Stowe's threat forced her hand. She added wood to the fire, checked the animals, ate her evening stew. The routine reasserted itself with the quiet authority of a tide returning to a shore it had never truly left. The blizzard announced itself through the rock before it appeared in the sky. A low vibration, more felt than heard, transmitted through the granite walls of the cave with a frequency that registered somewhere beneath conscious perception. Jessamine had grown fluent in the language of her shelter over the weeks of habitation. She knew the sound of wind changing direction, the subtle pressure shift that preceded a temperature drop, the way the fire's draw altered when a weather system approached from the northwest. This vibration was different, deeper, more sustained. The rock itself was resonating with the approach of something massive. She stepped outside. The sky had undergone a transformation that made her breath catch. The familiar gray ceiling of winter cloud had been replaced by something lower, denser, a bruised purple-black wall advancing from the northwest with visible speed, its leading edge rolling like smoke from a structure fire. The air had gone still, absolutely unnaturally still. No wind, no sound, even the usual creak of frozen branches had ceased. The world was holding its breath. She moved fast, hauled in the remaining firewood from the covered stack outside the cabin, filling every available space along the interior wall, checked the water supply in the stone basin, secured the animal pens, sealed the gap beneath the door with a rolled blanket. She worked with the focused economy of someone operating on a timeline. She could feel shortening with every passing minute. The first flakes arrived not as snow but as ice, small hard pellets that struck the cabin roof with a sound like thrown sand. Within an hour, the wind followed, rising from silence to a moan, to a shriek that seemed to originate from every direction simultaneously. She watched through the small window as the world dissolved. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding white wall of frozen particles moving at a velocity that stripped bark from exposed trees, scoured rock, erased every landmark, every horizon, every distinction from between ground, sky, distance, direction. She wedged a heavy log against the door as a brace. The wind pressed against the planks with a force she could feel through the wood. A physical hand pushing, testing, searching for weakness. The cabin groaned. Individual logs creaked in their notches. The chinking held. The stone chimney held. The flames held their rhythm in the hearth with steady indifference to the chaos outside. Within hours, the window went dark. Snow packed against the outer wall, covering the glass, sealing the cabin in a cocoon of compressed white. The roaring of the wind became muffled, filtered through tons of accumulating snow that acted as insulation, dampening the sound, thickening the walls, burying the structure alive. Inside, the contrast was staggering. Warm air, the smell of pine smoke, the soft bubble of the stew pot over the flames. She moved into the cave through the doorway connecting cabin to stone chamber. The transition was absolute. In the cave, the storm did not exist. No sound penetrated, no vibration reached this deep. The sheep chewed their cud with the placid disinterest of creatures who had never known a world beyond these walls. The chicken slept. The water kept its patient count against the stone basin. She placed her palm against the rock wall, cool, unmoved, eternal. This stone had endured 1,000 such storms, 1,000,000. It did not negotiate with weather. It simply persisted, offering its persistence to anyone wise enough to shelter within its indifference. The cabin was a fragile wooden shell, yes, but it was anchored to something that could not be shaken, could not be buried, could not be overcome. The banging came near midnight. She was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in the sleeve of her coat, when a sound separated itself from the storm's cacophony. Not the howl of wind, not the groan of stressed timber, a rhythmic, frantic thudding against the heavy plank door, desperate, weakening even as she registered it. Then a muffled cry nearly swallowed by the gale, carrying a quality she recognized instantly. Not aggression, not a predator testing the barrier. A human being at the outer limit of endurance, spending the last currency of their strength on the hope that something existed on the other side of this door. Her hand closed around the iron poker by the hearth. Fear came first, pure cold. The fear of a woman alone in a territory where the distance between her body, the nearest witness to any crime committed against it, was measured in frozen, impassable miles. Then the cry came again, weaker, a sound that was losing its fight with the wind, losing its fight with the cold, losing its fight with consciousness itself. She lifted the log brace, pulled the door inward. A figure collapsed across the threshold, more snow than human, crusted in ice from head to boots, face invisible beneath a frozen mask of frost, wool, exhaustion. The wind screamed through the opening, driving snow horizontally into the cabin, extinguishing the nearest candle, making the fire gutter dangerously. Jessamine grabbed the figure by the coat collar, dragged the dead weight across the floor with a strength she did not know she still possessed, slammed the door shut, replaced the brace. The wind's howl dropped to a muffled roar. Snow melted in dark patches across the cabin floor. She pulled the figure closer to the fire, peeled away the frozen scarf, the ice-stiffened hat. The face beneath was blue-white, the skin waxy, the lips cracked. She recognized him. Cotter Bry, the trapper who had mocked her from beside the pickle barrel, who had predicted her burial in this hollow, with the confidence of a man issuing a weather forecast. His eyes opened, unfocused, rolling. His words came in fragments torn from a throat too frozen to form complete sentences. Wagon. Overturned, half-mile east. His body convulsed with a cough that sounded like tearing fabric. Asked his wife, still there. Saw smoke. Your smoke. Thought I was seeing things. The cold knot in Jessamine's stomach tightened to a fist. 3 lives. Not 1. 2 more people were dying in the darkness outside, buried in a storm that would kill them before dawn, with the mechanical efficiency of a process that did not distinguish between the deserving, the undeserving, the repentant, the proud. Her mind performed its calculation with a speed that surprised her. Her food stores were rationed for 1 person through the remaining weeks of winter. Her firewood supply assumed a single occupant. Taking in 3 additional people would cut her margin to a razor's edge, perhaps beyond it. She would be risking her own survival, the survival of her animals, the survival of everything she had built through months of solitary labor, for the sake of people who had watched her walk out of town with her sheep, her crated chickens, her 50 pounds of salt, who had whispered poor thing behind her back, who had called her mad with the comfortable certainty of people who would never test their own assumptions against reality. The resentment was real. She felt it in her chest, a hot coal lodged behind her sternum, glowing with a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. They had scorned her, pitied her, predicted her death with the casual cruelty of people entertaining themselves with someone else's misfortune. Then she looked at Cotter Bry, his body shaking on her floor, his life measured in the diminishing interval between shivers. She looked at her warm cabin, the simmering pot, the cave beyond stocked with food, water, animals, the infrastructure of survival built by her own hands from nothing. A shelter that cannot save others is just a bigger coffin. The thought arrived with the clarity of something that had always been true, had simply been waiting for the right moment to announce itself. She wrapped Bry in her spare blanket, fed the fire until it roared. Then she dressed for the impossible. Every layer she owned went on. The wool scarf wound around her face until only her eyes remained exposed. She took the lantern, a coil of rope, the sealed pot of hot stew. She opened the door to chaos. The wind hit her with the force of a moving wall. Snow drove into every gap in her clothing, found the spaces between scarf folds, between buttons, between the fibers of the wool itself. The cold was not a temperature. It was a predator, intelligent, patient, systematic in its assault on the warmth of her body. She kept the cliff face to her left, her only landmark in a world where direction had been erased. The snow was waist-deep in the drifts, shallower where the wind had scoured the ground to frozen dirt. Each step was a negotiation, a calculated gamble that the ground beneath the next footfall would support her weight rather than drop her into a hidden crevice, a buried boulder gap. Time dissolved. Distance became meaningless. She moved through a white void that offered no landmarks, no progress markers, nothing to indicate whether she had traveled 50 yards or 500. The lantern's light penetrated no more than 3 feet, a small golden sphere of visibility moving through infinite white. She began counting steps. 100, 200. At 300, she saw it. A dark shape half buried in a drift, too angular to be rock, too large to be brush. The Haskell's wagon overturned, its undercarriage exposed to the sky, one wheel still turning slowly in the wind like the last gesture of a dying mechanism. Huddled in the lee of the wagon, pressed against the sheltering bulk of its bed, were 2 figures. Mr. Haskell had his arms around his wife, their bodies locked together in the desperate mathematics of shared warmth. Their faces, when her lantern light found them, were masks of disbelief. They had been waiting to die. The light was an impossibility, a hallucination produced by freezing brains, a final kindness of the nervous system before shutdown. Jessamine did not waste breath on explanation. The wind would steal any word before it traveled a foot. She pressed the sealed pot of hot stew into Mrs. Haskell's frozen hands, felt the woman's fingers close around the warmth, with a grip that was pure reflex, the body seizing heat the way a drowning person seizes a rope. She got them upright with gestures, with physical force, pulling Mr. Haskell to his feet by his coat lapels, steadying Mrs. Haskell when the woman's legs buckled on the first step. Then the 3 of them began the journey back, following the invisible trail. Jessamine had broken through the drifts. The cliff face a dark presence to their right now, the only fixed reference in a world of spinning white. Mrs. Haskell fell 3 times. Each time Jessamine lifted her, the woman's weight dragging against muscles that were already operating on reserves borrowed from tomorrow, from the day after. Mr. Haskell stumbled forward with the blind determination of a man whose pride would not permit him to collapse before the woman he had once dismissed as a fool. The wind tore at them. The cold found every weakness. The lantern blew out twice. She relit it both times with fingers so numb she could not feel the match between them. Relying on muscle memory, on the mechanical process she had repeated 1,000 times inside the cabin. The cabin door appeared in the lantern light like a vision. She threw it open. The 3 of them fell inside, a tangle of frozen clothing, gasping breath, the sudden violent contrast of warmth against skin that had forgotten warmth existed. She slammed the door, replaced the brace. The wind's howl retreated behind the logs, behind the chinking, behind the tons of insulating snow. Cotter Bry had managed to sit up by the fire, the blanket clutched around his shoulders. He stared at the Haskells as they collapsed near the hearth, his expression carrying the particular blankness of a man whose recent proximity to death has temporarily disabled his capacity for social performance. Mr. Haskell lay on the floor, chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then his gaze began to travel. He saw the fire, steady in its stone hearth, the neat stack of firewood along the wall, the cooking pot bubbling over the flames. The cabin walls, solid, chinked, holding the storm at bay with a quiet authority that mocked every prediction he had made about this structure, this place, this woman. His gaze reached the doorway leading to the cave. He rose to his knees, then to his feet, moved toward the opening with the halting steps of someone crossing a threshold into a space they are not sure they have the right to enter. The cave opened before him. The sheep looked up from their pen, chewing cud with bovine indifference to his arrival. The chickens rustled on their roost. The raised beds of soil held rows of pale green growth, vegetables emerging from earth that should not have supported life, fed by water that dripped from stone, illuminated by light, bounced from a mirror positioned with the precision of scientific instrumentation. The water basin, its surface clear, caught the glow of the lantern Jessamine held behind him, turning the small pool into a disk of captured light. She watched his face. The sequence was visible. Surprise, confusion, recognition. Then something deeper, something that moved across his features like weather crossing an open plain, changing everything it touched. Shame. The shame of a man confronting the distance between what he had believed, what was actually true, measured in sheep pens, in growing lettuce, in clean water, in the steady warmth of a shelter he had called a tomb. We were wrong. His voice cracked on the last word. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to the cave itself, to the evidence surrounding him, to the verdict it rendered on every dismissive word he had spoken in his store. We called you a fool. My God, we were the fools. Jessamine ladled stew into 3 bowls, handed them out without ceremony, without triumph, without the satisfaction she had earned the right to display. Eat, she said. The word contained everything that needed saying. The stew was hot. The bowls were warm. The proof of her wisdom was not in any speech she could deliver. It was in the simple, undeniable fact of nourishment offered by a woman who had been written off to people who had done the writing. The blizzard raged for 3 more days. During this siege, a transformation occurred within the walls of the cabin that was quieter than the storm, but far more consequential. The 3 guests, stripped of their assumptions by the brute force of their near death, observed Jessamine's routine, with the reverent attention of students watching a master demonstrate a discipline they had previously dismissed as beneath their consideration. They saw her rise before dawn to tend the fire. They saw her move into the cave with purpose, check the animals, water the garden, inspect the water flow. They saw the system, the interlocking dependencies of heat, water, food, shelter, each element supporting the others, each element requiring daily attention to maintain the whole. Mrs. Haskell, once she recovered enough strength to move, began helping without being asked. She took over the cooking, transforming Jessamine's utilitarian stew into something marginally more varied through a knowledge of seasoning, proportion that Jessamine had never acquired. Mr. Haskell repaired the door hinges that had loosened during the storm, his hands working with the competent ease of a man who had spent 40 years maintaining a building. Cotter Bry, the most physically recovered, split firewood with an efficiency that came from years of wilderness living, producing in a single afternoon a stack that would have taken Jessamine 2 days of labor. There were no grand apologies. The storm had burned away the capacity for performance. What remained was simpler, more honest. 3 people doing useful work inside a shelter built by a person they had underestimated. Their labor a form of acknowledgement more genuine than any words they could have composed. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The silence woke them. After 3 days of constant roaring, the absence of wind was itself a sound, a ringing emptiness that seemed to press against the ears. Jessamine opened the door to a world transformed. The snow lay deep, unblemished, dazzlingly white under a sky that had cleared to a blue so intense it hurt the eyes. The ravine had disappeared. The scrub brush was buried. Only the tops of the tallest pines broke the surface, dark spikes in an ocean of white. The 3 guests prepared to leave, their clothing dried by the fire, their bodies restored by food, warmth. 3 days of rest they had not earned but had been given freely. The departure was quiet, weighted with a significance that resisted articulation. Cotter Bry shook Jessamine's hand at the door, his grip firm, his eyes meeting hers with an expression that was equal parts gratitude, chagrin. He did not apologize for his remarks in the store. The handshake was the apology. Mr. Haskell pressed a gold coin into her palm. His fingers closed hers around it with a deliberateness that transformed the gesture from charity to something else entirely. "This is not a gift," he said, his voice carrying the careful weight of a man choosing words he intends to be remembered. "This is payment for passage, for supplies, for shelter provided to travelers by a station keeper whose judgment proved sounder than the judgment of every person in this county who believed they knew better." Jessamine accepted the coin. It was heavy in her hand. Not the weight of gold, which was measurable. The weight of recognition, which was not. Mrs. Haskell embraced her at the door. The gesture was brief, the woman's arms thin but strong, communicating through pressure what her voice could not manage without breaking. Then the 3 of them set out across the white expanse, following the ravine south toward Drover's Bend, their dark figures diminishing against the snow until they were specks, then memories. Jessamine closed the door. The cabin was quiet. The fire murmured in the hearth. In the cave, a hen announced an egg with its customary self-importance. She sat down at the hearth, the gold coin on her knee, the silence settling around her like water filling a vessel. The story the 3 survivors carried back to Drover's Bend traveled faster than any blizzard. Within a week, Jessamine knew, though she had no way of hearing it directly, that the tale had reshaped her reputation with the finality of a river changing its course. The foolish girl in the cave was dead as a narrative. The woman at Splitrock Hollow, the one whose foresight had built an ark of stone while the town wrapped itself in the false confidence of conventional wisdom, had taken her place. The legend was more useful than the truth, but in this case the legend was the truth, which gave it a durability that gossip alone could never achieve. She did not dwell on it. Reputation was currency she could not spend on flour or nails. What mattered was the system, its demands, its fragile equilibrium, the daily discipline of keeping it functional through the remaining weeks of winter. 3 weeks after the storm, in the brittle cold of a February morning, the sound of footsteps reached her again. Not hooves this time, not the confident tread of Leland Stowe. These were light, uneven, the stumbling gait of someone at the far edge of their endurance. She opened the door with the poker in her hand, a precaution that had become habit. The figure on her doorstep was small, thin, coatless, wearing only a wool shirt, trousers too short at the ankle, boots with soles worn through to the sock beneath. His face was red with windburn, his lips cracked, his eyes wide, with the particular desperation of someone who has been walking for days toward a destination they were not certain existed. He was 13 years old. His name was Thomas Whitmore. She pulled him inside before he could speak, sat him by the fire, wrapped the blanket around his shaking shoulders, brought water from the basin, stew from the pot, forced him to drink before she allowed him to explain. His words came in bursts, separated by shivering, by the chattering of teeth that would not obey his jaw's command to be still. Pa sold the homestead. The words carried the flat, factual weight of catastrophe reported by a witness too young to fully comprehend its implications. Sold it to a man from Cheyenne, took the money, started drinking. Really drinking. Not the way before. He was gone 3 days last time. 4 days this time. Then he did not come back. I waited a week. Then I left. The arithmetic of this information arranged itself in Jessamine's mind with brutal clarity. Her father had sold the family's last asset, converted it to liquor, disappeared. Thomas had been abandoned in a house that was no longer theirs, with no money, no adult, no plan, no option, except to walk to the only person he knew who might still have a door to open. 3 days of walking. In February, in the Wyoming Territory, without a coat, she looked at her brother, 13 years old, his frame showing the first awkward signs of the growth that would eventually make him taller than her, his face still carrying the softness of childhood beneath the windburn, the dirt, the exhaustion. The boy who had watched from behind the kitchen window as she walked away. The boy whose face she had refused to look at because looking back was a luxury. He was here now. Inside her system, her carefully balanced equation of resources, demand, supply. One more mouth. One more body requiring heat, food, water, space. Her winter provisions had already been depleted by 3 unexpected guests. The margin was thinner than it had ever been. Taking Thomas in was not generosity. It was an obligation that preceded calculation, that existed in a space where arithmetic held no authority. "You are here now," she said. Her voice contained no warmth that could be mistaken for sentimentality. It contained something more durable, certainty. "This is your home. You will work, you will learn. We begin in the morning." Thomas slept that night by the fire, curled beneath the blanket, his breathing gradually slowing from the ragged rhythm of exhaustion to the deep, even cadence of a body that had found safety for the first time in weeks. Jessamine sat across from him, watching the firelight move across his face, seeing in his features the echo of her own, the echo of their fathers, the echo of a grandmother neither of them had known, but whose legacy was the rocks surrounding them, the water dripping in the darkness, the improbable garden growing without sun. Morning brought a new dynamic. Thomas was not a guest. He was a resident, a permanent addition to the system, which meant the system needed to be recalibrated. Jessamine assigned him tasks calibrated to his age, his strength, his near-total lack of practical skills. He fed the chickens. He drew water from the basin. He carried firewood from the stack to the hearth. Each task was simple. Each task was essential. She showed him once, corrected him once, expected competence on the 3rd repetition. He learned fast, driven by the twin engines of eagerness to please, terror of being sent away. Within a week, Thomas had assumed responsibility for the morning animal care. He entered the cave at dawn, checked the water level, distributed the dried grass to the sheep, collected eggs with a tenderness that Jessamine noted silently as a useful predictor of his capacity for the more demanding work ahead. The ewe accepted his presence with equine pragmatism. The ram watched him with the same suspicious attention it directed at everyone, but did not charge. Thomas talked to the animals constantly, a running monologue of observation, question, narration that filled the cave with a sound Jessamine had not realized she missed. Another human voice, not directed at her necessarily, simply present. Evidence that the world contained more than one person, one set of hands, one mind calculating the distance between what existed, what was needed. The boy's presence changed the emotional register of the cabin in ways she had not anticipated. Meals were no longer solitary acts of refueling. They were shared, eaten across from another face, another pair of eyes. Thomas asked questions, constant questions. Why did the chimney draw better when the wind came from the northwest? Why did the lettuce grow toward the mirror? Why did the water never freeze inside the cave when the creek and the ravine froze solid in November? Jessamine answered each one with the economy of someone for whom words were tools, not decorations. Because the northwest wind creates a pressure differential at the flue exit. Because the mirror provides the light wavelength the plant needs. Because the rock maintains a constant temperature below the frost line. She was teaching. The realization arrived without announcement, without the self-consciousness that might have accompanied it had she been paying attention. She was transferring knowledge, hard-won, earned through failure, cold, blistered hands, to a younger mind that would carry it forward. The process was not sentimental. It was mechanical, necessary. The same impulse that drove her to stack firewood, tend the garden, check the chinking. Knowledge, like heat, dissipated if not actively maintained, actively passed from one vessel to another. February dissolved into March. The days lengthened perceptibly, each evening's light lingering a few minutes longer than the last. The sun climbing higher in its arc, the snow on the south-facing slopes beginning to develop a crust of melt freeze that glittered in the morning like shattered glass. The worst of the winter was behind them. Jessamine could feel it in the moderation of the pre-dawn cold, in the increased output of the hens, in the way the sheep stirred earlier each morning, sensing the shift in the season through mechanisms older than human awareness. But the thaw brought dangers of its own. Meltwater found its way into cracks in the cabin's chinking, freezing at night, expanding, widening the gaps she had spent the autumn sealing. The roof, which had held under the weight of dry snow, now sagged under the heavier burden of wet, compacted layers that refused to slide free. She spent a full day on the roof with Thomas, clearing snow with a shovel fashioned from a flat board, a branch handle, aware that a fall from even this modest height onto the frozen ground below could break a bone, end her capacity to work, cascade into a system failure from which there would be no recovery. The story from Drover's Bend reached her through an unexpected channel. Bertie Tanfield appeared on a morning when the snow had receded enough to make the 3-mile trek from her draw possible. Her walking stick punching through the crust with each step, her shawl pulled tight against a wind that had lost its killing edge, but retained its bite. She sat by the fire, accepted a cup of hot water flavored with the last of the dried mint Jessamine had found growing in a sheltered crack of the ravine, delivered her intelligence with the flat affect of someone reporting facts rather than opinions. Leland Stowe had filed a formal challenge to Jessamine's deed at the Territorial Land Office in Drover's Bend. His claim rested on 2 arguments. First, that Edith Whitmore's original registration of the claim was incomplete, lacking the required witness signatures. Second, that the property had been abandoned for a period exceeding the territorial limit, invalidating the claim even if the original paperwork was in order. The hearing was scheduled for April, after the passes cleared. Bertie delivered this information with the even tone of a woman who had survived long enough on the frontier stand that crises arrived on schedules of their own choosing, rarely convenient. Then she looked at Jessamine with those pale blue eyes that missed nothing, cut through everything. "Your grandmother prepared for this," she said. Not these specifics, but she knew someone would come for the land eventually. She was not a woman who left things to chance. Jessamine thought of the map on the deed, the arrow, the word keep. The second chamber she had not yet entered, waiting in the darkness beyond the passage she had marked during her first night, the passage she had been too consumed by the immediate demands of survival to explore. Bertie rose, leaned on her stick, moved toward the door. At the threshold she paused but did not turn. The same gesture she had used at their first meeting. The same refusal to face the person, receiving the words that mattered most. "What she left you is inside the rock. It has been waiting. It will wait a little longer, but not forever. Nothing does." The door closed behind her. The fire sent shadows across the walls. Thomas looked up from the rabbit snare he was learning to tie, his young face carrying the question he was too cautious to ask. Jessamine looked at the doorway to the cave, the darkness beyond the mirror's reach. The passage she had been deferring, postponing, circling around since the night she first read the word on the back of a dead woman's deed. The snow was melting. Stowe was filing papers. The hearing was 6 weeks away. The answers she needed were not in Drover's Bend, not in any territorial office, not in the arguments of any attorney. They were 50 feet behind her, in a chamber carved by water 1,000,000 years before anyone had thought to claim the ground above it. She added a log to the fire, checked the mirror's angle, collected 2 eggs from the nesting box. The routine continued. But beneath it, a decision was forming with the slow, irresistible pressure of water finding its path through stone. She would go in. Soon, when the light was right. When Thomas was strong enough to manage the cabin alone for the hours she would need. When the season turned enough to forgive a morning spent away from the endless cycle of maintenance that survival demanded. The cave waited, patient as the stone it was made of. Holding its secrets with the same indifference, it held its temperature, its water, its silence. 30 years it had kept Edith Whitmore's truth. It could keep it a little longer. But Bertie was right. Not forever. Outside, the snow continued its slow retreat. The sun climbed higher. Somewhere south, in an office in Drover's Bend, a man with 4,000 acres was sharpening his claim against a woman with 40. The odds were his. The evidence she suspected was hers. The distance between suspicion, proof, was the length of a dark passage she had not yet walked. When she was ready. On her own terms. The way she had done everything since the latch clicked shut behind her. She chose a morning when the light was strongest. The March sun had climbed high enough to send a blade of illumination deep into the cave entrance, past the mirror's reach, filling the main chamber with a diffused gray luminance that softened the shadows without eliminating them. Thomas was assigned the cabin. Tend the fire. Feed the animals. Do not leave the structure for any reason. He accepted the instructions with the solemn nod of a boy who understood that obedience was the rent he paid for his place in this household. Jessamine assembled her kit with the deliberate care of someone preparing for a journey whose distance could not be measured in miles. The lantern, its reservoir full of rendered fat that would burn for 4 hours. A coil of rope, her knife. The deed folded into her breast pocket, the map on its reverse side now committed to memory, but carried anyway as a talisman, a connection to the hand that had drawn it. She stood at the threshold of the main chamber, facing the narrow passage in the far wall that she had marked on her first night, the passage she had deferred through months of construction, crisis, survival. The opening was barely wider than her shoulders, a dark slit in the granite that exhaled a breath of air slightly cooler than the chamber around it. Moving air meant space beyond. Space meant a destination. She lit the lantern, turned sideways, entered the passage. The rock pressed close. The walls were smooth, water-carved, bearing the sinuous curves that millennia of flow had sculpted into the stone. The ceiling dropped until she had to duck, then dropped further until she was crawling on hands and knees. The lantern held ahead of her in one fist, its flame guttering in the draft that flowed steadily toward her from whatever lay ahead. The passage narrowed. For 10 terrible feet, it compressed to a width that required her to exhale, fully flatten her body, pull herself forward with her elbows. The rock scraped her shoulders through her dress. The sound of her own breathing was enormous, amplified by the close walls into a rhythm that seemed to belong to the mountain itself. Then the passage opened, not gradually, but suddenly, the walls falling away on both sides, the ceiling leaping upward into darkness beyond the lantern's reach. She stood, brushed the grit from her knees, held the lantern high. The chamber was smaller than the main cavern, perhaps 20 feet across, roughly circular, its walls streaked with mineral deposits that caught the light in veins of green-blue, the dull gleam of oxidized metal. The floor was flat, swept clean by hands that had been here before her. Against the far wall, resting on a natural shelf of stone at waist height, sat a tin box. It was the kind used by prospectors to store documents in the field. Its lid sealed with a simple clasp, its surface spotted with rust but structurally intact. Beside it, arranged in a row with the deliberate precision of objects placed as evidence, were 3 small rocks. Each was the size of a hen's egg. Each bore on its fractured face a distinctive reddish-green stain that Jessamine recognized from descriptions she had heard in Drover's Bend, from the conversations of miners passing through, from the language of the frontier's extractive economy. Copper, native copper, embedded in the host rock, exposed by fracture, unmistakable in its color, its weight, its implications. She set the lantern on the stone shelf, opened the tin box. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had preserved its contents against the damp of decades, was a journal. Not a diary in the personal sense, not a record of feelings or daily events, but a working document. The cover was stiff canvas, the pages dense with a handwriting she had never seen, but recognized instinctively as belonging to a mind that operated the way her own did, methodically, precisely, without ornamentation. Edith Whitmore's hand. She read standing in the lamplight, the journal held close, the pages turning with a care that honored both their age, their content. The entries spanned years, not months. They were dated sporadically, clusters of writing separated by gaps of seasons. Sometimes years, the record of a woman who wrote only when she had something worth recording. The earliest entries described the discovery. Edith had found the copper vein during her 3rd year on the claim. Following the passage, Jessamine had just crawled through, driven by the same curiosity about the moving air, the same refusal to leave a question unanswered. Her descriptions were technical, detailed, the observations of a woman who had taught herself geology from a Zizzle textbook, purchased with egg money from a general store in a town that no longer existed. She had identified the vein as substantial, running deep into the cliff face, potentially extending beneath the surrounding territory. She had chipped samples, tested their weight, compared them against the illustrations in her book. Her conclusion, recorded in a hand that did not waver, was unambiguous. The vein was significant, commercially viable. Worth, by the rough calculations she performed using published prices, a sum that dwarfed anything a homesteader in the Wyoming Territory could hope to accumulate in a lifetime of labor. Then came the entry that changed everything. Dated 11 years after the discovery, written in a hand that had aged but not weakened, it occupied a full page. Jessamine read it twice, the words settling into her understanding with the slow, irreversible weight of a truth that once absorbed rearranges the furniture of the mind. A man from the Consolidated Mining Company found his way here last spring. He had a map, a magnetometer, the confidence of a person who believes that knowing where something is constitutes a right to take it. I sent him away. He returned with an offer, then with a better offer, then with a lawyer who explained in the patient voice one uses with children that the territorial government compel a mineral lease if the landowner refused voluntary terms. I sent them all away. They will return again. They always do. What they do not understand, what their instruments cannot measure, is this. The copper is not the value of this land. The water is the value. The temperature is the value. The shelter is the value. The capacity to sustain life through winters that kill everything on the surface is the value. If they blast their shafts, run their sluices, build their stamps, the vibration will crack the water channel. The dust will contaminate the spring. The cave will become a mine, which is to say it will become a wound, producing wealth for a decade, producing nothing forever after. I will not permit this. The land is not a commodity. It is a covenant. I keep it whole so that it may keep whole whoever comes after me. Jessamine closed the journal. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. But something had shifted behind her ribs, a tectonic adjustment of understanding that would never reverse. Her grandmother had not been a recluse, had not been mad, had not been the family's embarrassment, the stubborn old woman clinging to worthless rock out of spite or senility. Edith Whitmore had been a guardian, a woman who had discovered a fortune beneath her feet, who had understood with perfect clarity that extracting that fortune would destroy the thing that made the land worth keeping, who had chosen poverty over profit, silence over disclosure, the long game of preservation over the short game of wealth. The deed was not a mockery passed from a dead woman to a disposable granddaughter. It was a trust, a responsibility, a test. She gathered the journal, the 3 copper samples, placed them back in the tin box, sealed it. She left the chamber the way she had entered, crawling through the narrow passage, emerging into the main cavern with grit on her elbows, lamp oil on her fingers, the box clutched against her chest. Thomas looked up from the fire as she came through the cabin doorway, his face bright with questions he was learning to delay until she was ready to answer them. "Not yet," she told him. Her voice carried a weight he had not heard before, the particular gravity of someone who has just accepted a burden that will last longer than the carrying soon. But not yet. She made the walk to Bertie Tanfield's Draw the following morning, the 3-mile trek through softening snow that had become passable, if not pleasant. Bertie's cabin was a structure that made Jessamine's look palatial by comparison. A single room of weathered timber roofed with sod, its chimney leaking smoke from 3 separate cracks. The old woman opened the door before Jessamine could knock, as though she had been waiting, which perhaps she had. Waiting was something Bertie Tanfield did well. She had been doing it for 30 years. Jessamine set the tin box on the narrow table, opened it, removed the journal, placed the 3 copper samples beside it, their reddish-green faces catching the weak light from Bertie's single window. Bertie looked at the objects. Then she sat down in her chair, the only chair, her hands folding in her lap with a stillness that was not calm but its opposite, the stillness of a woman holding herself together against a current of emotion that decades of stoic frontier living had not fully armored her against. Her eyes glistened. She did not wipe them. Tears at her age were too rare to be wasted on vanity. "She made me promise, Bertie," said her voice carrying the tremor of a vow finally reaching its expiration. 30 years. I watched her grow old on that rock. Watched her turn away the mining men. Watched her bury the evidence deeper every time someone came sniffing around. She could have been rich. Could have moved to Denver, San Francisco. Could have lived in a house with wallpaper, a cook stove that did not leak smoke curtains. She chose the cave. She chose the water. She chose to keep the land whole, for someone who would understand why it mattered more in one piece than in 1,000 pieces of ore. Bertie's eyes found Jessamine's. The connection between them was not the connection of friendship, which implies choice, but the connection of inheritance, which implies obligation. "She chose you," Bertie said, "before you were born, before she knew your name. She knew someone would come for the land. She made sure the evidence would be waiting when they did." Jessamine opened the journal to the last pages. Here, tucked between the final entries, pressed flat by the weight of the closed cover, was a document she had not fully examined in the dim light of the hidden chamber. She unfolded it now, spreading it on Bertie's table. A deed registration form, completed in Edith's precise hand, bearing the stamp of the Territorial Land Office, dated 1859. 2 witness signatures at the bottom, their ink faded but legible. One belonged to a name she did not recognize, a surveyor presumably, or a clerk. The other belonged to Bernadette Tanfield. Bertie touched her own signature with one crooked finger, tracing the letters she had written 3 decades ago. "I rode 40 miles to the land office with her to file this," she said. The clerk recorded it in the Territorial Register. The original stayed with Edith. The copy stayed in the office. If Mr. Stowe's attorney had looked in the correct register rather than the county index, he would have found it. But men like Stowe do not look for evidence that contradicts their intentions. They look for absence, then call absence proof. Jessamine refolded the registered deed, placed it in her breast pocket alongside the one her father had given her. 2 documents, one unregistered, one registered. One a map to a secret, the other the legal proof that the secret's guardian had done everything required by law to secure her claim. Leland Stowe's case rested on the assertion that Edith's registration was incomplete. The document in Jessamine's pocket was the refutation, carried from a tin box in a hidden chamber in a cave that the entire territory had dismissed as worthless. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of April. Jessamine used the intervening weeks to prepare, not her arguments, which required no preparation because they consisted entirely of physical evidence. She prepared the homestead. The work served a dual purpose. Every improvement she made strengthened both her legal position, since territorial law required demonstrable improvement of a claim to maintain its validity, her actual survival infrastructure. She built a cold, smoking rack in a fissure of the cliff face, using flat stones stacked into a narrow chimney through which she could funnel smoke from smoldering green wood, curing the rabbit, squirrel meat that would supplement her provisions through the transition into spring. Thomas helped, his competence growing daily, his questions becoming more specific, more technical, less the questions of a child seeking reassurance, more the questions of an apprentice seeking mastery. The ewe was pregnant. Jessamine had known since February, reading the signs in the animal's broadening flanks, her hench increased appetite, the particular waddle that developed in her gait as the weight shifted forward. She calculated the lambing date against the calendar, hoped for late April, after the worst of the cold had broken, when the new grass would begin to push through the snowmelt on the south-facing slopes. The ram paced his section of the pen with the restless energy of a creature whose biological work was done, whose remaining contribution was genetic, invisible, carried in the belly of his mate. The garden had survived the winter, more than survived. The carrots pulled from their beds in early March were small but edible, their flavor concentrated by the slow, cool growing conditions into something sharper, sweeter than any surface-grown root she had tasted. The lettuce had produced 3 successive crops from the same beds, each harvest followed by a replanting, the cycle sustained by the cave's unchanging temperature, the water's constancy, the mirror's redirected light. She had expanded the beds, carrying more soil from the ravine as the snow retreated, planting potato starts from the eyes she had saved, storing them in the cool dark since autumn. April arrived with a softness that felt like mercy. The snow retreated up the slopes, revealing ground that was brown, sodden, rich with the moisture of months of melt. The creek in the ravine began to flow, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence, its voice joining the chorus of dripping, trickling, flowing water that characterized the thaw. Birds returned. The hawk was back, circling over the ravine with a territorial assertion that Jessamine understood instinctively. "This is mine. I built here. I endure here. I will not be moved." The morning of the hearing, she dressed in her better dress, the one she had been preserving for precisely this kind of occasion, though she had not known what form the occasion would take when she first set it aside. It was worn, faded, patched at one elbow, but it was clean. She combed her hair, braided it, pinned it in a manner she remembered her mother wearing, before the consumption had taken her, before her father's grief had metabolized into the cold arithmetic that would eventually push his eldest child out the door with $17, a useless deed. She placed the registered copy of Edith's claim in her pocket, the journal she left behind, hidden in the tin box in the second chamber, the copper samples she left beside it. What she carried to the hearing was proof of legal ownership. What she left behind was the secret that legal ownership protected. The distinction was crucial. Stowe wanted the land because he wanted the water. If he learned about the copper, his desire would intensify beyond the capacity of any legal proceeding to contain. Men who wanted water filed claims. Men who wanted copper filed armies. Thomas stayed at the cabin. The walk to Drover's Bend took a full day, the trail still muddy, the creek crossing swollen with meltwater that soaked her boots, numbed her feet. She arrived in the early evening, the town's single street busier than she had seen it, the hearing having drawn spectators from the surrounding ranches, the way a prize fight draws men who have no stake in the outcome but cannot resist the spectacle. She slept in the storeroom of Haskell's Mercantile, on a cot the proprietor offered without charge, his manner toward her transformed so completely from their first encounter that it might have been a different man behind the counter. The hearing convened in the morning in the back room of the Territorial Land Office, a space barely large enough to accommodate the participants, let alone the audience that pressed in from the street, filling the doorway, the window, any aperture that offered a line of sight. The Territorial Commissioner, a man named Aldrich, presided from behind a desk covered in documents, his face bearing the weary neutrality of a bureaucrat who had adjudicated enough land disputes to find them tedious. He was neither friend nor enemy. He was process. Jessamine respected process. Leland Stowe occupied one side of the room, accompanied by a man in a dark suit whose posture communicated legal education, urban origin, a professional life spent in rooms cleaner than this one. This was his attorney, brought from Cheyenne at considerable expense, a fact Stowe's bearing communicated with the quiet confidence of a man who understood that the ability to import expertise was itself a form of power. Stowe wore the same heavy coat, the same wide-brimmed hat. His expression was pleasant, controlled, the face of a man who believed the outcome was already determined, the hearing a formality required by a system whose conclusion he had purchased in advance through preparation, resources, the asymmetric advantage of wealth applied to a contest against poverty. Jessamine stood on the other side, alone, no attorney, no advisor. Her worn dress, her calloused hands, her braided hair, her stillness. She looked to the assembled audience like exactly what Stowe's case required her to be, a girl playing at a woman's game, overmatched, outspent, destined to lose with the quiet inevitability of a candle burning down to its wick. Stowe's attorney presented first. His argument was structured, rehearsed, delivered with the polished cadence of a man accustomed to audiences. The Whitmore claim, he contended, suffered from 2 fatal deficiencies. First, the original deed lacked proper registration with the Territorial Land Office. No record of Edith Whitmore's claim appeared in the county index. Second, the property had been effectively abandoned upon Edith's death, with no continuous habitation for a period exceeding the territorial statute of limitations for unimproved claims. The land, therefore, had reverted to territorial jurisdiction. Mr. Stowe, as an adjacent landowner with demonstrated capacity to improve the parcel, was filing a legitimate claim under the territory's homestead provisions. The attorney produced documents, maps showing Stowe's surrounding holdings, a letter from the county clerk confirming the absence of Whitmore's name in the county index, a surveyor's report describing the parcel as unimproved, uninhabited, bearing no evidence of productive use. Each document was presented with the theatrical precision of a card player laying down a winning hand. Commissioner Aldrich reviewed each document, made notes, asked clarifying questions with the mechanical thoroughness of a man following procedure. Then he turned to Jessamine. "Miss Whitmore, you may respond." She stepped forward. The room was silent except for the creak of floorboards under shifting weight, the rustle of spectators adjusting their positions for a better view. She reached into her pocket, removed the registered deed, unfolded it, placed it on the commissioner's desk. "Your attorney searched the county index," she said, her voice carrying the flat, measured quality of someone who has rehearsed nothing because the truth requires no rehearsal. "My grandmother did not file with the county. She filed with the Territorial Land Office directly in 1859, before the county system was established. The registration is in the Territorial Register, Volume 7, page 43. The document before you is the original, bearing the territorial stamp, the date of filing, 2 witness signatures." Commissioner Aldrich picked up the document, examined the stamp, compared the date against a reference volume he pulled from the shelf behind his desk. His eyebrows rose. He looked at Stowe's attorney. The attorney's composure, until this moment a professional constant, developed a hairline fracture. She continued, "Regarding abandonment, my grandmother inhabited the Splitrock Hollow claim continuously from 1859 until her death in the spring of 1883. 24 years of unbroken habitation. The claim then passed through inheritance to my father, Reuben Whitmore, who transferred it to me in September of 1883. I have inhabited the claim since October of 1883. 6 months. I have constructed a cabin against the cliff face, built a fireplace, chimney, established livestock pens within the cave structure, cultivated a subsurface garden producing root vegetables, lettuce, installed a water collection system from the natural spring. The improvements are demonstrable. They are verifiable. Any member of this community who has visited the site can confirm their existence." The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the silence of an audience watching a foregone conclusion. It was the silence of an audience realizing that the conclusion was being rewritten in front of them. Mr. Haskell stood. He did not ask permission. He simply rose from his position near the wall, his bulk commanding attention, the way a boulder commands the attention of water flowing around it. He addressed Commissioner Aldrich directly. "I have been inside that cabin. I have seen the cave." His voice carried the blunt authority of a man whose word was currency in this town, accepted at face value because it had never been debased by dishonesty. "I was trapped in the blizzard of January with my wife, with Mr. Bry. Miss Whitmore rescued all 3 of us, brought us into her shelter, fed us, housed us for 3 days. What she has built on that land is not a squatter's camp. It is the most thoughtfully designed homestead I have encountered in 40 years of frontier living. The improvements exceed in ingenuity, if not in scale, anything on any ranch in this county, including yours, Mr. Stowe." Cotter Bry stood next. His testimony was briefer, harder. "I was dying on her doorstep. She opened the door. The wind was trying to kill me. She went out into it to find the Haskells. Any person in this room who questions whether that land is improved, occupied, put to productive use can walk up there themselves. Take a look. Bring warm clothes. It is a long walk back to town if she decides not to let you in." A murmur moved through the room, the low collective sound of a community revising its assessment in real time. Commissioner Aldrich studied the territorial registration, compared it against his reference volume, wrote notes. Stowe's attorney requested a recess. Aldrich denied it. The proceedings would conclude today. The commissioner's ruling was delivered without ceremony. The territorial registration was valid. The chain of inheritance was documented. The improvements were attested by credible witnesses. Miss Whitmore's claim to the Splitrock Hollow parcel was affirmed. Mr. Stowe's petition was denied. Stowe absorbed the verdict with the external composure of a man practiced at losing battles while planning campaigns. He nodded to the commissioner, collected his attorney, moved toward the door. As he passed Jessamine, he paused. His expression was not hostile. It was recalculatory, the look of a man updating his model of an opponent he had underestimated. "You have your grandmother's stubbornness," he said, his voice low enough to be heard only by her. Jessamine met his eyes. She did not step back. She did not look away. "I have her land," she replied. "The stubbornness is my own." Stowe left. His attorney followed. The room exhaled. Haskell approached her outside the land office, the spring sun warm on the muddy street, the crowd dispersing with the satisfied energy of spectators who had gotten their money's worth. He extended his hand. She shook it. The grip was firm on both sides, the handshake of equals, the physical expression of a relationship that had been renegotiated through storm, stew, shared survival. "I owe you a debt that a handshake does not settle," he said. "My store is open to you. Not as charity, as trade. You bring what you produce. I extend credit against it. Fair rates. Honest ledger." Jessamine accepted. The arrangement was commercial, practical, built on mutual interest rather than sentiment. It was exactly the kind of relationship she trusted. The walk back to Splitrock Hollow took a full day. She arrived at dusk, the cabin chimney trailing its thin plume against a sky streaked with the pink, orange of a spring sunset so vivid it looked theatrical, a set designer's exaggeration. Thomas met her at the door, his face carrying the particular anxiety of a boy who has spent 24 hours alone with responsibility, has survived it, wants badly to report his competence. The fire was burning, the animals were fed, the eggs were collected, the garden was watered. Everything held, he reported, his voice managing to be both matter-of-fact, barely concealing pride. Everything held, she confirmed. The words applied to more than the cabin. That evening, after Thomas had fallen asleep by the fire, Jessamine returned to the hidden chamber. She crawled through the passage for the third time, the route now familiar, the tight section less frightening, the darkness less absolute. She opened the tin box, removed the journal, read the final entry, the one she had skimmed in her first visit, the one that now, in the aftermath of the hearing, carried a resonance that vibrated through her entire body. Edith had written it in her last year, the handwriting slightly tremulous but still precise. "If you are reading this, you have found the room. You have seen the copper. You know what this land contains. You now hold a choice that will define everything that follows. You can sell the mineral rights. The money will be considerable. It will buy comfort, security, a life insulated from the hardships I have endured here for decades. But the mine will destroy the cave. The blasting will fracture the water channel. The sluice operations will contaminate the spring. Within 5 years, the shelter that sustained me through 25 winters will be rubble, dust, a hole in the ground producing ore for men who will never sleep here, never drink from this water, never understand what they have destroyed. Or you can do what I did. Keep the copper in the rock. Keep the water in the channel. Keep the cave whole. The land will not make you rich. It will make you durable. Wealth is what you accumulate. Durability is what you become. I chose durability. I hope you will understand why." Jessamine closed the journal, placed it back in the tin box, sealed the lid, left the copper samples on the stone shelf where Edith had arranged them decades ago, 3 small rocks bearing the evidence of a fortune that would remain exactly where it was. Unextracted, unannounced, protected by the silence of a woman who had died, the silence of a woman who had sworn an oath, now the silence of a woman who had crawled through a passage in the dark, read the words of a grandmother she had never met, understood them with a comprehension that bypassed the intellect, landed somewhere deeper. She would not mine the copper. She would not sell the mineral rights. She would not mention the copper at the hearing, in the store, to Haskell, to Bry, to anyone whose knowledge might eventually reach a man like Stowe, or worse, a company like Consolidated Mining, whose appetite for ore would not be deterred by a young woman's claim, a territorial ruling, a dead grandmother's journal. The secret would remain in the rock. The water would continue its patient drip. The cave would continue its function as a shelter, a well, a garden, a fortress. The choice was Edith's legacy, passed through stone, through paper, through blood, to the granddaughter she had never seen but had somehow prepared for. April deepened. The ewe lambed on a Tuesday morning, in the quiet of the cave, on the bed of dried grass. Thomas had prepared under Jessamine's instruction. The process was swift, clinical, the animal's body performing its ancient function with an efficiency that required minimal human intervention. The lamb was small, white, wet, its legs folding beneath it like jointed sticks as it attempted its first stand. Thomas watched with an expression of unguarded wonder that temporarily displaced the careful composure he had been constructing since his arrival. The lamb found its mother's teat within the hour, its tail twitching with the frantic enthusiasm of a creature encountering sustenance for the first time. 2 lives where there had been one. The equation of the homestead had shifted again, in the direction Jessamine had planned for, worked toward, calculated with the same precision she applied to every element of her system. The flock would grow. The eggs would continue. The garden would expand. The cycle of input, output, maintenance, growth would continue its spiral, each revolution slightly wider than the last, each season producing marginally more than the season before. The snow was gone from the valley floor by late April. The ravine ran with clear water, its voice a constant presence now, a sound she had almost forgotten during the months of frozen silence. Green appeared on the east-facing slopes, first as a suggestion, then as a declaration, the dormant grasses pushing upward through the mat of dead vegetation, with a force that seemed impossible for something so delicate. She planted the potato starts in the patch of earth outside the cabin, the soil enriched over the winter with composted animal waste from the cave pens, turned with a shovel she had fashioned from a flat stone lashed to a branch. The ground was dark, moist, receptive. She pressed each piece of seed potato into its hole, covered it, moved to the next. The work was meditative, repetitive, requiring just enough attention to prevent her mind from wandering, but not enough to prevent it from thinking. The first visitors arrived in early May. Not Stowe, not threats, neighbors. A rancher from south of Drover's Bend, whose wife had heard the blizzard story, brought a sack of seed potatoes, a variety different from Jessamine's, offering genetic diversity, resilience, the accumulated wisdom of a strain that had survived other winters in other soil. A blacksmith named Corwin, whose forge in town produced the hardware the frontier required, rode up with a set of iron hinges for the cabin door. Their weight, their precision, a vast improvement over the wooden pin hinges Jessamine had carved from hardwood. He asked for nothing in return, then corrected himself. He asked for eggs. A dozen eggs if she could spare them. His hens had died in the blizzard. Hers had not. The transaction was completed on the spot, eggs for hinges, the oldest form of commerce, conducted between two people who recognized in each other the fundamental seriousness of survival. More came. A woman from a ranch east of the creek brought jars of preserved peaches, received in exchange a bundle of dried rabbit pelts. A young man whose family ran cattle on the flats below the ridge offered a day of labor in exchange for permission to water his horse at the cave spring. Jessamine accepted each offer, evaluated each trade, maintained the ledger of exchange with the meticulous attention of a woman who understood that commerce was the sinew connecting isolated homesteads into something resembling a community. She was not the town's charity case. She was not its curiosity. She was its newest trading partner, accepted not because the town had grown kinder, but because she had demonstrated competence that the frontier's economy valued above all other currencies. Thomas thrived. The word was precise. He did not merely survive, which implied endurance without growth. He grew. His body filled out on the improved diet of eggs, lamb's milk, fresh vegetables from the expanding cave garden. His skills multiplied. He could split firewood with 3 strokes where he had once needed 7. He could mend a sapling fence by feel in the near darkness of the cave. He could read the weather from the behavior of the hawk, the direction of the wind, the particular quality of light on the western ridge at sunset. Jessamine taught him the way Bertie Tanfield had taught her, without softness, without encouragement, without praise. She taught him by correction, by demonstration, by the simple expectation that he would observe, replicate, improve. He did. The process was not affectionate. It was something more lasting. It was the transmission of competence from one generation to the next, the oldest form of inheritance, more valuable than copper, more durable than stone. She visited Bertie one last time in May, carrying a jar of fresh butter she had churned from the ewe's milk, a luxury so improbable in this landscape that Bertie stared at it for a full minute before accepting. The old woman's health was declining. Her cough had deepened over the winter, her frame shrinking inside the heavy shawl that seemed to grow larger as she grew smaller. She sat in her chair, the butter jar on the table beside her, her pale eyes fixed on Jessamine with an intensity that communicated more than her thinning voice could manage. She would be proud, Bertie said. Not because you kept the land, because you understood why. Jessamine did not respond. The statement required no response. It was a closing, the final line of a conversation that had begun 30 years ago between 2 old women on a piece of rock that the world considered worthless. A conversation that had been carried forward through silence, through oaths, through a deed passed from hand to hand like a baton in a relay, whose finish line was not a destination but a principle. She walked home in the late afternoon light, the trail dry now, the mud of spring, hardening into the packed earth of early summer. The landscape had been reborn. The sage was green. The juniper bore new growth at its branch tips, pale green against the dark foliage. The hawk circled overhead, its shadow skating across the rocks below, a moving marker on a map that only the hawk could read. She reached the cabin at sunset. Thomas was outside, replacing a section of the chinking on the north wall that had cracked during the spring thaw. He worked with a focus that excluded everything beyond the immediate task, his hands moving with the automatic competence of someone performing an action they have performed enough times to transcend conscious thought. Watched him for a moment from the trail, unseen. 13 years old, working on a wall he would maintain for years, decades perhaps, learning the rhythms of a place that would shape him as surely as the water had shaped the stone. She looked at the cliff face above the cabin, the sheer gray granite that rose 200 feet above the roofline, its surface scarred, pitted, ancient. She did not see a wall. She did not see a barrier. She saw a plan. The fissure at the 40-foot mark where a cold smoker could be built into the rock, its natural draft channeling smoke from green alder through a 12-foot chamber of hanging meat. The broad, flat section at ground level where a greenhouse could be constructed. Its back wall, the heat-absorbing stone that would radiate warmth through the night, extending the growing season by weeks on either end. The deeper sections of the cave where a root cellar could be excavated, expanding the storage capacity, allowing her to cure, preserve, stockpile against the next winter. The winter after that, every winter that would come for as long as the rock stood. The work was not over. The work would never be over. She understood this not as a burden, but as the fundamental nature of the life she had chosen, the life her grandmother had chosen before her, the life that Thomas was now learning to choose for himself. A homestead was not a product to be completed. It was a process to be sustained. A daily negotiation between human intention, natural force, the implacable demands of a landscape that did not care whether its inhabitants thrived or perished but offered to those who paid attention the tools for either outcome. She walked to the cabin. Thomas looked up from his work, mud on his hands, a streak of it across his forehead where he had wiped away sweat. She nodded at the wall. "Solid work," she said. The compliment was spare. It was sufficient. She entered the cabin. The fire was burning. The stew was simmering. In the cave beyond, the lamb bleated, a high, thin sound that echoed off the walls, mixing with the cluck of hens, the steady drip of water, the deep mineral silence of the stone. She reached into her pocket, felt the deed, its brittle paper warm from her body heat. The map on its reverse side, the arrow pointing inward, the word keep. She left it in her pocket. Its instructions had been followed. Its secrets were safe. Outside, the sun dropped below the ridge. The sky burned orange, then pink, then the deep luminous blue that preceded the stars. The first star appeared above the cliff face, a single point of light in the immense dark, steady as the water counting its rhythm in the cave below. Jessamine stood in the doorway of her cabin, the warmth of the fire at her back, the cool breath of the cave behind that, the vast indifferent beauty of the frontier, spreading before her in every direction to the edge of the visible world. She had been given nothing. She had built everything. The land was hers. The secret was hers. The work was hers. The peace she felt was not the peace of completion, which was an illusion, a lie told to people who had never built anything worth maintaining. It was the peace of continuation, the peace of a woman standing at the center of a system she had designed, constructed, defended, a system that would outlast her the way the stone outlasted the weather, the way the water outlasted the rock, the way the truth, buried deep enough, protected fiercely enough, outlasted every lie ever told about it. The fire crackled. The lamb slept, the stars multiplied. She closed the door, latched it from inside, sat down to the warmth of a meal she had grown, harvested, prepared with hands that had earned every callus, every line of competence written into their roughened skin. The cabin held, the cave held, the land held, she held.